The airport buzzed with the usual chaos of a Monday morning. Travelers shuffled through security lines, their faces lit by the glow of boarding passes on their phones. Among them was Amara Carter, a 22-year-old college student with a backpack slung over one shoulder and a heart full of anticipation. This wasn't just any trip, it was her first time leaving the country, her first step into a dream she'd nurtured for years. Ghana awaited her, a semester abroad to study African history and reconnect with her roots. She clutched her passport tightly, the small blue booklet feeling like a golden ticket to a new world. At the gate, passengers lined up to board the flight. Amara adjusted her scarf, her locks neatly tucked beneath it, and smiled at the thought of the adventures ahead. She handed her boarding pass to Claire Hargrove, a seasoned flight attendant with a crisp uniform and a demeanor as stiff as her starched collar. Claire scanned the pass, her eyes flicking to Amara's face and then to her passport. "This doesn't look like you," Claire said, her voice sharp, slicing through the hum of the boarding process. Amara blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" Claire held up the passport, comparing the photo to Amara's face. "The hair, everything, it doesn't match." Amara forced a polite smile, though her chest tightened. "That photo was taken 2 years ago. I've changed my hairstyle, but it's definitely me." Claire's lips pressed into a thin line. She flipped through the pages, her movements deliberate, as if searching for something, anything, to justify her skepticism. "You're sure this is your passport?" "Yes," Amara said, her voice firm now. "I'm sure." A few passengers behind her shifted uncomfortably, their murmurs growing louder. Claire's eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that." Before Amara could react, Claire tore the passport in half. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet gate area. Amara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "What are you doing?" Claire's face was a mask of cold authority. "If this is fake, you're not getting on this flight." Amara's mind raced. Her passport, her lifeline to Ghana, to her dreams, was now in pieces. She felt the weight of every eye on her, the heat of their stares burning into her skin. "You can't do this," she shouted, her voice trembling with anger and disbelief. The commotion drew the attention of the gate agent, who rushed over. "What's going on here?" "She destroyed my passport," Amara said, holding up the torn pieces. "For no reason." Claire crossed her arms, her tone dismissive. "I had reasonable suspicion. It's my job to ensure the safety of this flight." The gate agent's eyes widened as he took in the scene. Behind him, a passenger held up a phone, recording everything. The captain emerged from the jet bridge, his expression darkening as he approached. "Claire, what's the meaning of this?" he demanded. Claire hesitated, her confidence faltering for the first time. I was just doing my job." Amara stepped forward, her voice steady now, fueled by a rising determination. "Your job isn't to humiliate me or destroy my property. I demand accountability." The captain glanced at the torn passport, then at Claire, his jaw tightening. "We'll handle this immediately." As the situation escalated, Claire's smug demeanor cracked, revealing a flicker of fear. She had crossed a line, and the weight of her actions was beginning to sink in. For Amara, this was no longer just about a passport. It was about dignity, justice, and the right to exist without being questioned for simply being herself. The plane wasn't the only thing about to take off. So was a storm. The gate area erupted into chaos. Passengers, their phones raised like torches, captured every moment of the unfolding drama. Amara stood at the center, clutching the torn remnants of her passport, her chest heaving with a mix of anger and disbelief. Claire, the flight attendant who had moments ago wielded her authority like a weapon, now looked pale and uncertain, her hands trembling at her sides. The captain, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "Everyone, please remain calm. We're handling this." He turned to Amara, his tone softening. "Ma'am, I'm deeply sorry for what's happened. Let's get this sorted out." Amara nodded. Though her eyes burned with unshed tears, she wasn't just upset about the passport. She was furious at the blatant disrespect, the assumption that she didn't belong. The gate agent quickly ushered her to a nearby seating area, offering water and assurances that the airline would make things right. Meanwhile, Claire was pulled aside by the captain. His voice was low but sharp, each word a dagger. "What the hell were you thinking? Do you have any idea how bad this looks?" Claire's mouth opened and closed, her usual confidence shattered. I thought the passport was fake. It didn't look like her. I was just doing my job." "Your job isn't to play judge and jury," the captain snapped. "You've put this airline in a terrible position. Do you realize this is already going viral?" Claire's stomach dropped as she glanced at the crowd. Phones were still recording, and the murmurs of outrage were growing louder. She could hear snippets of conversation. "Did you see that? How could she do that? This is racism, plain and simple." Back at the seating area, Amara was surrounded by sympathetic passengers. A woman handed her a tissue, while a man offered to call his lawyer friend. "You don't have to take this lying down," he said. "What she did was wrong." Amara nodded, her mind racing. She had worked so hard for this opportunity, scrimping and saving for the plane ticket, filling out endless paperwork, dreaming of the day she'd step onto Ghanaian soil. And now, because of one woman's prejudice, it was all in jeopardy. The airline's ground staff arrived, their faces grim. They apologized profusely to Amara, promising to expedite a replacement passport and cover all costs. But Amara wasn't satisfied. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "This is about accountability. That woman can't just get away with this." As if on cue, the captain returned, his expression grave. "Miss Carter, we've made a decision. Claire Hargrove has been terminated, effective immediately." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Claire, who had been hovering nearby, froze. Her face went ashen, and for a moment, it seemed like she might argue. But then her shoulders slumped, and she turned away, clutching her badge as if it might somehow undo what had just happened. Amara watched as Claire was escorted out of the gate area, her head bowed. There was no satisfaction in the moment, only a hollow ache. This wasn't the way things were supposed to go. She had wanted to board her flight, to start her adventure, not to be the center of a scandal. As the crowd began to disperse, the gate agent approached Amara again. "We've rebooked you on the next available flight. It leaves in 6 hours. In the meantime, we'd like to offer you a voucher for meals and any other accommodations you might need." Amara accepted the voucher, but her mind was elsewhere. She pulled out her phone and opened social media. The video was already everywhere, hashtags like #PassportPrejudice and #JusticeForAmara trending. Strangers were sharing their own stories of discrimination, and the airline's official account was flooded with demands for accountability. For the first time since the ordeal began, Amara felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a movement. But as she sat there waiting for her new flight, she couldn't shake the image of Claire's face, the shock, the fear, the realization that her actions had consequences. And Amara couldn't help but wonder, what happens next? By the time Amara's rebooked flight was ready for boarding, the video of Claire tearing her passport had already amassed millions of views. Social media was ablaze, the incident sparking a firestorm of outrage and debate. Hashtags like #TornPassport and #FiredOnTheSpot trended globally, with celebrities, activists, and everyday users weighing in. The story wasn't just about one flight attendant's actions. It was a lightning rod for discussions about systemic racism, bias, and accountability. Amara, seated in the first-class cabin courtesy of the airline's apology, scrolled through her phone, overwhelmed by the flood of notifications. Messages of support poured in from strangers around the world, but so did hateful comments from those who accused her of playing the race card. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was bigger than that. Meanwhile, Claire Hargrove sat in her car in the airport parking lot, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her phone buzzed incessantly. Calls from reporters, texts from former colleagues, and a barrage of social media alerts. She had deactivated her accounts, but the damage was done. The video was everywhere, and so was her name. Her phone rang again. This time it was her daughter, Emily. Claire hesitated before answering. "Mom, what the hell happened?" Emily's voice was sharp, laced with anger and disbelief. Claire winced. "It's not what it looks like, Em. I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Emily interrupted. "Your job was to tear up a black woman's passport because you didn't think she looked right? Do you hear yourself?" Claire opened her mouth to argue, but no words came. Emily's voice softened, though it still carried an edge. "Mom, when are you going to realize that this kind of thing isn't okay? You can't keep pretending like your actions don't have consequences." The call ended, leaving Claire alone with her thoughts. She stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror, her face pale and drawn. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to think about the things she'd buried deep, the offhand comments she'd made, the times she'd turned a blind eye to injustice, the way she'd been raised to see the world through a lens of us versus them. Back on the plane, Amara leaned her head against the window, the hum of the engines a steady backdrop to her racing thoughts. She opened her laptop and began drafting a statement. If people were going to listen, she wanted to make sure her voice was clear. Hours later, as the plane touched down in Accra, Amara's statement was already live on social media. It was concise but powerful. "What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a larger problem, one that affects countless people every day. I'm grateful for the support I've received, but this isn't just about me. It's about holding institutions accountable and creating a world where no one has to fear being treated differently because of who they are." The post went viral within minutes, accompanied by the hashtag not just Amara. Stories began flooding in from people of color around the world, sharing their own experiences of discrimination while traveling. The airline, already under fire, issued a formal apology and announced plans to implement mandatory bias training for all staff. But for Amara, the fight was far from over. As she stepped off the plane and into the warm Ghanaian air, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just a study abroad trip anymore. It was the beginning of something bigger. And for Claire, sitting alone in her empty apartment, the storm was just beginning. The world had seen her actions, and now she had to face the consequences, not just from the airline or the public, but from herself. The question lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken. What happens when the spotlight fades, but the work remains? The days following the incident were a whirlwind for Amara. While she immersed herself in her studies in Ghana, her story continued to dominate headlines. The airline, desperate to salvage its reputation, announced sweeping changes: mandatory bias training, a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, and a $100,000 scholarship fund for Black students pursuing international education, named in Amara's honor. But Amara wasn't satisfied with gestures. When the airline's legal team reached out with a settlement offer, she declined. "This isn't about money," she told her lawyer over a crackling Zoom call. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Her lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Naomi, nodded approvingly. "Then let's push for systemic change. We'll draft a list of demands: policy reforms, public accountability, and a seat at the table for marginalized voices." Meanwhile, Claire Hargrove was navigating her own storm. Jobless and ostracized, she spent her days scrolling through news articles and social media posts, each one a fresh reminder of her downfall. Her savings were dwindling, and the few friends who still spoke to her did so in hushed, awkward tones. One afternoon, Claire received an email from a racial equity organization offering free workshops. The subject line read, "Understanding Bias, a Path to Growth." She hesitated, her finger hovering over the delete button. But then she thought of Emily's words, "When are you going to realize this isn't okay?" and clicked register. The workshop was held in a small community center, its walls adorned with posters proclaiming messages like "Justice starts with you" and "Unlearn to relearn." Claire sat at the back, her arms crossed, as the facilitator, a soft-spoken woman named Maya, began the session. "Today, we're here to confront our biases," Maya said, her gaze sweeping the room. "Not to shame or blame, but to grow." Claire shifted uncomfortably in her seat. As the workshop progressed, She found herself confronted with uncomfortable truths about privilege, systemic racism, and the harm caused by microaggressions. For the first time, she began to see her actions not as an isolated mistake, but as part of a larger pattern. Back in Ghana, Amara stood before a crowd of students and journalists at a press conference. The air was thick with anticipation as she stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady. "What happened to me was not an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a system that too often fails to protect and respect people of color. But it's also an opportunity for change, for growth, for justice." She outlined her demands: transparent reporting of discrimination incidents, an independent review board for passenger complaints, and ongoing diversity training for airline staff. The crowd erupted into applause, but Amara wasn't done. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice rising. "It's about everyone who's ever been made to feel less than because of who they are. It's about creating a world where no one has to go through what I did." As the press conference ended, Amara was approached by a young girl no older than 10, clutching a notebook. "Miss Carter," the girl said shyly, "you're my hero." Amara knelt down, her eyes filling with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "But remember, heroes aren't born, they're made. And you can be one too." That night, as Amara lay in bed, she thought about the journey ahead. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, she felt a sense of hope. And for Claire, sitting alone in her apartment, the journey was just beginning. She pulled out a sheet of paper and began to write, "Dear Amara." But when she sent the letter, it was returned unopened with a note from Naomi: "Accountability isn't absolution. Do the work and maybe one day you'll earn the right to apologize." The message was clear. Justice wasn't just about words. It was about action. And both women, in their own ways, were learning what that meant. 1 year later, the world looked different for both Amara and Claire, though their paths had diverged in ways neither could have predicted. Amara stood on a sunlit balcony overlooking the bustling streets of Accra, her laptop open to a draft of her latest article. She had become a prominent voice in the fight against racial injustice, her story inspiring countless others to speak out. The airline, under pressure from her advocacy, had implemented sweeping reforms, including a passenger bill of rights and a diversity task force. Amara had been invited to join as a consultant, ensuring that marginalized voices were heard at the highest levels. But her work didn't stop there. She had partnered with NGOs to create a global initiative called Open Skies, which provided resources and support for travelers of color. The program had already helped hundreds of people navigate discrimination while traveling, and Amara had been invited to speak at the United Nations about its impact. As she gazed out at the city, her phone buzzed with a notification. The airline had just announced a new policy: mandatory cultural competency training for all employees, developed in collaboration with Open Skies. Amara smiled, a sense of quiet pride swelling in her chest. This was what change looked like: slow, imperfect, but undeniable. Meanwhile, Claire Hargrove sat in a small office at a nonprofit that assisted refugees and immigrants. She had started as a volunteer, sorting donations and helping with paperwork, but her dedication had earned her a part-time position. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was meaningful, and for the first time in years, Claire felt like she was making a difference. The workshop she had attended had been a turning point. It wasn't easy to confront her biases, to unpack the ways she had contributed to systemic harm. But with time and effort, she began to see the world through a new lens. She joined a book club focused on anti-racism, attended protests, and even reached out to Emily to apologize for the ways she had failed her as a mother. Their relationship was still fragile, but it was a start. One afternoon, a young girl named Fatima walked into the nonprofit with her mother. They had just arrived in the country, their faces etched with exhaustion and hope. Claire greeted them warmly, her heart aching at the sight of the girl's wide, nervous eyes. "Welcome," Claire said, kneeling to meet Fatima's gaze. "How can we help you?" The girl's mother explained that they needed assistance with travel documents to reunite with family in another state. As Claire guided them through the process, she couldn't help but think of Amara, of the pain she had caused and the work she was doing to make amends. When the paperwork was complete, Fatima looked up at Claire and smiled. "Thank you," she said softly. Claire's eyes filled with tears. "You're welcome," she whispered, "and welcome to your new home." That night, Claire sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea steaming in front of her. She pulled out a notebook and began to write. Not an apology this time, but a reflection. "Change isn't easy," she wrote. "It requires humility, courage, and a willingness to face the parts of yourself you'd rather ignore. But it's worth it, because every small step forward is a step toward a better world." As she closed the notebook, she thought of Amara, of the countless lives she had touched, and felt a flicker of hope. They were on different paths, but perhaps, in some small way, they were moving toward the same horizon. And for Amara, standing on that balcony in Accra, the future felt full of possibility. She had turned a moment of pain into a movement for change, and though the work was far from over, she knew she wasn't alone. The world was changing one step at a time, and both women in their own ways were part of that change,